What's up, everybody? This is George CLC Samuels, Managing Director of Faiā, here with my good buddy, Stefen Deleveaux. And today we're going to be going deep into the world of DAOs, talking about decentralized autonomous organizations, separating the hype from the reality, and just looking at sort of how communities are actually evolving in this space. Stefen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So maybe to start us off, would you like to just give a little bit of an overview of your career history, what has led you up to today?
Man, how much time you have? But I'll give this short version. So I am the president of the Caribbean Blockchain Alliance. We're a nonprofit that's basically dedicated to pushing blockchain adoption in the entire region. That's across the board, whether it's infrastructure, Web3, all those different aspects. And we have two mandates, one being education and the other being public policy. And we're actually in the middle of a real push for education of student communities. So that's what I do mainly, and that's what we've been kind of pushing for the last few years, because we realize that the potential and the opportunity for people to actually understand this technology and actually use it and implement it is massive. So it's something that we're really passionate about. And outside of that, I'm very involved in Web3 in general, especially in terms of DAOs. So I am a steward of the DAOist, which is basically a think tank for DAOist culture, the DAO ecosystem in general. I recently just published an article called basically about the ecology of DAOs, thinking of DAOs as a full ecosystem rather than as regular businesses, because they're quite different and they represent a new and potentially more human way to interact with each other in terms of work. So that's kind of the focus there. I also work a little bit with a few other DAOs, such as Prime DAO, which is building DAO-to-DAO collaboration tools, and a few other small ones. So that's the gist of all the different things that I'm trying to be involved in, pretty much.
You sound like me, man. We got a lot of moving parts, right? Handling a lot of different projects and things.
It's a lot.
For anybody who's listening and who's entrepreneurial, you'll know the same challenges. But of course, there are going to be people listening in who have no idea what a DAO is, and even when you explain the acronym, they still don't know what the hell you're talking about. So do you want to just give a rundown of what exactly is a DAO?
The problem in the space is that all the ways that we use to break something down are just as expansive and just as long as the actual thing. So DAO, obviously, it stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organizations, which are we use three long words to describe something. But when you break it down, I guess we can make it a little easier, and then we can kind of use more human language after that. So the idea of it being, obviously, the ethos of the entire crypto blockchain space in general is being decentralized. So obviously, if you have an organization or a business or a company or a corporation, there are, you have a CEO or you have some kind of head that usually makes all the decisions, or at least the majority of the decisions. And of course, if it's for profit, they get the majority of the returns as well, and the majority of the ownership. The idea of a DAO is to kind of branch that out a bit. So it's not just one person at the top. You have, whether it's workers, contributors, all these people that are also a part of the entity, the organization, since they also play an important role. So the idea is they should also be part of either decision making or ownership, or both. And for those of you who are familiar with co-ops, cooperatives, worker cooperatives, farmer cooperatives, that kind of thing, it's very similar, except it's a bit more digital and a bit more crypto native. But the idea is, but that's of course where the decentralization comes from, because one, it uses blockchain and crypto, which is where the decentralization aspect comes from, but also the fact that it's less top heavy and a bit more grassroots, a bit more bottom up. More people are involved in decision making, more people are involved in ownership. So the autonomous, that part is actually the hardest to explain because there's a lot of back and forth on that. So initially, when the idea of a DAO first came out, the autonomous part really meant, automatic. It was supposed to be an entity that's fully run by smart contracts, right. Something that actually was not supposed to be very human. It's supposed to be like a business or organization that basically ran itself. Yeah. Over time, that shifted because of a lot of different technical issues and also a kind of social shift, I guess you could say. I realize I'm going in a roundabout way, but the focus became a lot more human, a lot more focused on people being able to engage in these organizations, work in these organizations easily, and in a way where they have a bit more say in what happens. Again, a bit more ownership in what happens. And just one of the core ideas of DAOs is like, if you join a DAO and you see that something needs to be done and you're good at whatever it is, you jump in and you do it, even if no one tells you to. And then, you get paid for it because you're providing work. So this is the idea of like the autonomy where you're not being told what to do by a boss per se. You're going in, you're comparing like what you're good at with what needs to be done. And if there's a space to do that work, you do that work and you get paid for it. So it's a lot more, again, it's a lot more decentralized. And it's something where even someone who is at the bottom has a lot more say in what happens. So that's still obviously something that's kind of complex in a way, but it's basically the ideas behind DAOs. It's, but even at the end of the day, you can think of it as a digital co-op or a crypto co-op, because you use crypto-based treasuries or crypto wallets, and that's where the entity gets its money or where it holds its money. And you use I don't want to go too much into the technical stuff. Basically, you get paid in crypto, and that automatically enables anyone in the world to be a part of these organizations. Because if you're using wires or just checks and things like that, that adds a lot of issues, complexities, fees, all that stuff. But if you're doing it with crypto, you can automatically scale globally, no matter where you are. So that's kind of still a bit complicated, but decent enough explanation.
No, I think you did well, and I think this also highlights why there is still like a bit of confusion for people, right? And that's okay, because that's what happens, I guess, when you bring in any new technologies. Like what I often see is that people are trying to map, what's happening with what people are familiar with for those who are trying to get into the space, and right. So I think the analogy you gave of a digital co-op is an apt one, because I think that's what I saw as DAOs started to get more popular, right? I was like, these are just essentially co-ops, but the mechanism from which these co-ops can operate is just, as you said, digital, right? So exactly. Crypto payments, maybe the use of smart contracts, it's more the things that around it for the management. So people coordination and the management. So I wanted to get into that because I've seen you talk about that on Twitter, right? A lot of the challenges I see for people with DAOs is the people coordination side. What has been your experience? What do you think is going on there?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I mean, there are pros and cons to basically every kind of system, every kind of organization. So while I personally much prefer the DAO route to, say, a traditional company because of this, especially in terms of like the autonomy and the ownership aspects, I do definitely recognize that in a lot of ways it's more difficult because, the thing that we're trying to move against, which is, one person at the top or a few people at the top telling you what to do, you also realize that organizational structure is very easy because everyone else just, you follow instructions and you get the job done. So for a DAO, or even for a co-op, there's always the issue of more, what's the phrase? Too many cooks or more
too
cooks
many
in the kitchen.
chefs, in the kitchen.
There you go.
Sort of thing. Yeah, 100%, yeah.
So I mean, there is the idea of you're trying to come to consensus at the end of the day. So when there's more people trying to make decisions, obviously that leads to just a more difficult way of getting there. Or even if it's not as difficult, it probably will still be slower, because then you have to organize everyone to have a vote and make the decision. But of course, the benefit to that is the hope, at least, is that you get to somewhere that's a bit more, where there's more consensus, where the people you work with on a daily basis are happier with the decisions that are being made and are more, interested in actually getting things done. To actually go back to the previous idea of like how we got here in the first place, at least for me personally. So I studied economics, and I actually did my undergrad thesis on cooperatives, worker cooperatives. And the idea of that was that one of the underlying questions behind that was, what would the economy, wherever you are, look like if there were more cooperatives compared to like traditional businesses? And while doing that, I saw a lot of benefits in these structures. And it wasn't until early this year that I looked at the DAO space and I was like, wait a minute, this is basically that exact same thing in a lot of ways. So it's these like very strong trade-offs that you really have to figure out and be sure of what you're doing, because there are a lot of good and a lot of like more difficult aspects. So in terms of the coordinating people, you basically have to make sure that you have the right tools. And there's a lot of DAO tools being built right now, a lot that are already in use, but it's still a lot of inefficiency, and it's still a lot of like effectiveness that needs to be built. But I think, a lot of people that are building these tools currently, they very much understand the issues. They understand what needs to be done. So I think that aspect alone will improve quite a bit. But yeah, basically it's just, you have all these different aspects, a lot of people that you have to deal with, a lot of, typical issues with democracy, that where it is good, obviously, but you have to make sure it's easy enough to be done, or accessible enough, or that people are engaged enough. So to wrap it up, that's kind of all of those things in one.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. Yeah, that you kind of studied this, and you happen to just stumble upon, right, like in the space that you're kind of already operating, and that this is like a manifestation of what you had studied. And I think what is really fascinating is from at least from what I'm seeing. Do you remember or recall holacracy? Or did you ever come across that? Yeah, right. Do you remember what happened with the holacracy movement?
In terms of the history, no, not as much.
So I think it was, what's his name? Zappos guy, the founder of that company, Tony Hsieh.
Okay.
Yeah, he was responsible for sort of popularizing holacracy, or at least trying to apply it in the real world. And I remember it was a very radical change, because he was all about like sort of, decentralizing things as much as possible, or making it flat, right? And I've seen this, having gone from like startups to corporate, right? You see this often battle between the two of like, as you go larger, it goes into more hierarchical, but then those who get tired of not being seen or heard want to collapse it, right? Because of the power dynamics.
Right.
With holacracy, it was a great idea, but it failed in the end because of exactly the same things I'm kind of seeing with DAOs. And also the lots of chefs spoil the soup sort of thing.
Right.
And an interesting thing came up about career growth. So people, when everybody's flat and everybody's equal, some don't feel like they have a sense of growth in terms of advancement of their career. And maybe we just haven't come up with a system to handle that yet. I don't know. But that was what happened to holacracy. So they went flat, but then there were people who actually started to go, well, how do I know that I'm progressing? If everything is flat and everybody's working equally, and I just jump into any project I want to, because that's what they were playing with.
Right.
How do I feel a sense of growth? And then when I worked for another corporate, that was something that kept coming up. As I started to like go flat, the employees themselves, the workers, they were like, how do I know I'm advancing in my career? What am I gonna do? So, you know, do you see that potentially taking shape in a DAO ecosystem as well?
That's really interesting, actually. And this also raises the question of like, you know, you're creating a movement, you're creating a shift, but you're coming from, you know, 99% of people will be coming from the previous or the traditional system. Exactly. So it's like you have all of these you still have all of these ways of thinking that come from that you will eventually have to completely shift or move away from. So that's something that I actually haven't seen necessarily come up in the DAO space, but I think that may be because, well, one is still early, so you never know, but I think it's also a lot of the people I engage with have already been kind of playing around with DAOs for a while. Mm-hmm. So I think they're just already a bit more attuned to how this is evolving. Yep. And at the same time, I think what we see in DAOs is that depending on, so let me backtrack a bit. Sure. So obviously the idea is not like the idea that we kind of talk in the way that we talk about it is no leadership, but I think it actually turns out to be a bit more liquid leadership, meaning that if someone is very knowledgeable or someone is pushing to get things done, they may be the de facto leader for one particular thing or for just a certain period of time. And then when the shift, when the, you know, when something else needs to be done, then someone else comes up and pops up and becomes de facto leader for, again, a short amount of time or for something similar. So it becomes something where when something specific needs to be done, someone may, you know, end up with a bit more, not actual power, but maybe a bit more social power for a short time, where, you know, people may start looking to them, but you also know that the next day it's basically someone else's turn because someone else has this kind of specialization or way of thinking that needs to be pushed forward. So I think that's something that's probably going to happen more, where there's not, even though there's no particular leadership, there is, you know, specific leadership for certain things. So I guess at the end of the day, in terms of like career growth, I think we'll just see that happen more often. But at the same time, there's also this mentality of people who have already been working in DAOs for a while that the growth is more tied to the entity itself than the individual. So that if you're working on certain things and you know you have a role, because specific roles are completely fine in DAOs, that doesn't necessarily change. And you see that the DAO is getting better or progressing in certain things, you do feel that same sense of, okay, this is going well because I'm getting better at this, or my team is getting better at this, or just the couple people I work with in the specific area are getting better. So I think that's how it shifts a bit, where you're maybe not looking at individual growth, because even the word career in DAOs it becomes much different. So it is a complete shift. Yeah, but that's really interesting. That's something I would love to think about more.
Yeah, no, and it's good you're open to it, you know, because I think as I'm getting older, you know, like I started looking back into history more and more and start trying to like be like, has this happened before, but under different skin, right? You know? And like, even as you're talking, I'm also thinking about when I was dealing with like agile scrum movement within enterprise, right? And I realized like it was similar too, because, you know, they took out the leader role and manager roles and they brought in the scrum master, right? And his role was more like a facilitator, you know? He wasn't there to be the boss, he's the facilitator. And you had people, depending on project, it was project basis, that there would be different leads. And right, as you mentioned, you know, the roles, they still need to exist because of structure, but based on the projects, you could have different leaders. And even then, I remember in like reality dealing with it, like different companies still required like a certain culture so that would work, you know? That's another thing that comes into play, is that there are certain cultures that are either going to work with things like maybe a DAO, or Agile Scrum. And if it doesn't gel, then either, like the company entity will need to change its culture, or they just be like, okay, it doesn't work, So how would you describe the culture of people in the DAO space currently?
Oh man. It's interesting because you find a lot of, first and foremost, the people that gravitate toward DAOs, I do find them to be a lot more, I'm trying to use the right words here, just thoughtful, because they really want this, new type of system, new type of organizational structure, coordination structure to work. And they're willing to either step back or push forward when necessary. So that I find pretty interesting. I've also seen people who didn't do well in DAOs to be the type that are just less of self-starters. Like some people, it's not a bad thing. Some people need to have more structure. Yeah. Some people need someone to push them in a proper direction or tell them what to do. So that's a bit more difficult in DAOs, and that's perfectly fine. So yeah, I would say more people who are, fully into DAOs, they're definitely more of self-starters. They're definitely a bit more curious and willing to experiment and try out certain things. And I think something that we don't talk about enough is failure. We need to accept and embrace failure more often, because a lot of times, especially with new things, where things are not going to work out and we need to shift or move around or try something else. So yeah, I definitely find that people are in the space are more accepting of failure and more willing to try everything and figure things out. And just in terms of working together, because you're working with, depending on the size of the DAO, obviously, but you're working with multiple people at one time, no matter what. So that's something that's key. You have to be able to work well with other people, including people you either, aren't going to see every day because you're not in an office, and two, you may not even know them. Like, there are a lot of people who are completely anonymous in DAOs, or pseudonymous, I should say. Yeah. And that's easier in crypto culture because that's already kind of a thing. Yeah. But we're definitely going to see more DAOs with people who you may not know, like their actual names. But and I will say that seemed to actually go quite well, which is very interesting. Yeah. So
the pros and cons, right? Yeah.
Exactly. They're definitely pros and cons. I think as DAOs expand and we see them get implemented, especially because let's be honest, most of the DAOs are, at least the ones that we see and talk about, are based in like the US, maybe Europe, the global north. As this idea expands, and especially as people get more access to crypto in general, then it'll be easier for DAOs to pop up in various communities, various countries. I think when that happens, that's when we'll really see what the future of DAOs is going to look like. I think they're going to look very different to what they look like now, at least moderately different. Yeah. We're going to see a lot of large DAOs in, say, the DeFi space doing different kind of finance stuff. I think we're going to see a lot more small, fully co-op style DAOs in like the Caribbean or the Pacific Islands, things like that. Yeah. And that they will be a lot more just human focused on like certain small local needs. I think they'll also be able to, since they'll be working in blockchain and crypto, they'll be able to raise funds a lot easier. They'll be able to like be agile, move around a lot more, do different kind of things with experimentation. So that's what I'm actually really excited for.
And it sounds like, I guess the movement too is reducing friction, right? Like, yes. Yeah. Okay. Because as you're talking, I also think about just like, it makes sense because in the world, right, when COVID hit, a lot of people started working remotely. A lot of people went into freelance, they quit their jobs. And so you got a lot of those types who are in a stage where it's experimenting, trying to find out what works and what not. And so I find it very fascinating because I think definitely as the ecosystem matures, I'm sure, yeah, there'll be stuff we'll see, that'll be like, oh, okay, didn't see that coming, or,
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right. So what are some of the, I guess, good examples of DAOs that you've seen to date?
Yeah. We can make that pretty wide ranging too. So the easiest example of a small DAO, I helped start a DAO called Her Story DAO, where it was basically made up of, I'm not an NFT artist, but it's made up of like pretty much everyone but me, actually. Are NFT artists, mostly Black women. And the focus of it is it's a NFT collector DAO. So we basically collect art from Black women globally, just as a way to one, support, but also to kind of keep that history, to keep that the verification, which is very important for NFTs, as not to say a museum, but just as a way to kind of like hold what we think is just important art. Yeah. And that we started that in March of last year, and that's been pretty amazing. And it's also very small. There's maybe somewhere between 15 and 20 of us. I think about 15. So, and that's something that will also probably remain small. So, and this is interesting too, because a lot of DAOs are massive with thousands of people. And that's where I think that's what people see when they look into DAOs. They see like the giant ones like Constitution DAO and stuff like that. But the small ones get overlooked. But I think the small ones are actually, I don't want to say which is more important, but I think that's the one that people will really be interested in and take their own versions of to start their own, that kind of stuff. One of the best running ones I've seen is Index Co-op. They are basically, what they do is they take different crypto assets, different digital assets, and make indexes out of them. As in financial indexes, where instead of you buying and trading necessarily one crypto at a time, rather you have a tranche or a what's a better word for it? Just a grouping basically of crypto together. So you only have to interact with that one index instead of whatever's inside of it. And that allows for just ease, functionality, cheaper interactions, things like that. But the way the structure of the DAO is actually quite good. They're separated into different teams, different work streams. Some of the teams have their own governance, because obviously the governance is one of the most important parts, because instead of, again, the CEO, COO, et cetera, CFO making those decisions almost exclusively, it's more of like everyone's involved in governance. Everyone's involved in governance, and sometimes some models will break out into different teams, focus on different things, and those teams will have their own governance. And there are like tools that are focused on that. Like there's Orca that's focused on the pod example, which is again completely separate teams that have their own governance, and then you come together to push the entire DAO forward. So those are kind of like the really good examples. You have collector DAOs. You have other collector DAOs that are much bigger, like Pleaser DAO. They also collect NFTs, but they do it at a much higher price range. And then, of course, I guess I have to include the Constitution DAO that everyone saw and got like really popular, where they raised like millions of dollars in order to buy a copy of the Constitution.
That was wild. Yep.
It was wild to see. It didn't work.
Yeah. I saw, but interesting experiment, right? Yeah.
It was a crazy idea. I no shade, because a lot of my good friends were part of that. I personally felt like, there could have been better things done with the money. But,
sure. Human beings, man.
But again, very interesting experiment.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw that, man, and I was just like, Wow, this is fascinating. You know, we like some people complain about like Elon Musk like going to Mars, and meanwhile, like, you know, we've got this. It's like, oh, auction, we the people. Um, and yeah, you know, at the end of the day, we got to just look at our own behaviors, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. But brother, I feel like, you know, we should probably have a follow-up session on this stuff. But I'd like to like kind of have one last thing for you to cover. In this space, if someone's looking to get started, what would you recommend to them? What would your advice be?
That's an interesting point. So one of the things that is really, I think, going to come up, has already started to come up, but will definitely come up this year, is service DAOs, where you have, and just as you mentioned before, a lot of people have turned to freelance. And they're basically freelance DAOs, whether it's, you know, for developers within a DAO or even PR people within a DAO. You'll have a lot of people who are doing freelance in various things come together to form DAOs where they all kind of work together, instead of, because freelancers, the majority of the time work alone, work by themselves.
Exactly,
So
yeah.
it can be very lonely. So now you'll have like groupings where you either work together, or at the very least you'll learn stuff together. You'll trade tips and whatnot, and you work towards some kind of common goal, whether that is having the people within the group being pushed towards different contracts, different clients, things like that, and you kind of like figure out internally how you're going to operate, how you're going to interact with these clients. But yeah, I think that's going to be one of the main ways people get in, because they're already quite a bit for a lot of people. There's Odyssey DAO, for example, where it's about providing education, introduction to Web3, introduction to DAOs, and doing it. At the end of the day, all of these things are like, how do we do this together? How do we make sure that anyone in the world can help or assist or contribute in different ways? So I would say that's the best thing. I mean, when you're trying to get into crypto, when you're trying to understand it, the first aspects are always like either developing, like software developing, or like finance. Now we've reached a point where no matter what your expertise is, no matter what your experience is, there's definitely somewhere that you can jump in. Because some of these DAOs are big and need a lot of different kind of, whether you're an accountant, whether you're in media, everything, like there's something for everybody. So it's going to be a lot easier to find a role for yourself.
Love it. And finally, how can people follow you?
I'm on Twitter more often than I should be. You can follow me at Stef Deleveaux, so STEFDELEV. I'm also on LinkedIn, even though I don't use that as much. Definitely check out Caribbean Blockchain Alliance. It's CBA Hub, so CBAHUB.org. It's also CBA Hub on Twitter.
Perfect. No worries. I will put all the links in the show notes for you. And yeah, that wraps up our session. Thank you so much, brother. I think I'll probably check in with you again in the future, right? As the ecosystem starts to mature, and we'll see you on Twitter.
It'll be fun.